The year is 570 AD in the vast expanse of the Arabian Peninsula, where the sun bleaches rocks white and the horizon shimmers like a mirage. Three great empires cast their shadows across the known world. To the north, the Byzantine Empire stretches. From Constantinople to the gates of Damascus, its purple banners flying over marble cities and golden churches. To the east, the Sassanid Empire of Persia commands ancient trade routes with fire altars burning in Zoroastrian temples. And between them, like a jewel suspended in time, lies Egypt, the crown prize that has fed empires for 3,000 years. But in the desert valleys of Arabia, where Bedouin tribes follow the same paths their ancestors carved through sand and stone, something is stirring. Something that will shake the foundations of the world. The world on the edge picture. The Arabian Peninsula in the 6th century, a land that the great empires considered little more than a buffer zone between their eternal conflicts. The Byzantines and Persians had been locked in warfare for generations, draining their treasuries and exhausting their armies in an endless dance of conquest and counter-conquest. To them, Arabia was a backwater, populated by nomadic tribes and scattered settlements, useful only for trade routes and mercenary soldiers. Yet this supposed backwater was about to birth a revolution that would reshape 3 continents: the Arabia of this era was a complex tapestry of tribal confederations, merchant cities, and religious traditions. Mecca stood as the commercial heart, where caravans from Yemen met traders from Syria, and where the sacred Kaaba drew pilgrims from across the peninsula. Medina, then called Yathrib, buzzed with agricultural wealth and the tensions between Arab tribes and Jewish clans. Between these oases of civilization stretched the desert, harsh, unforgiving, but also liberating in its vastness. This was a world where a man's word was his bond, where poetry was prized above gold, and where tribal loyalty could mean the difference between life and death. It was also a world in transition, caught between the ancient traditions of the desert and the cosmopolitan influences of Byzantine and Persian merchants who brought not just goods, but ideas, including whispers of a new monotheistic faith. Emerging in the cities, the birth of a future conqueror into this world. Sometime around 573 AD was born Amr ibn Alaz, ibn Wael al-Sami. His very name tells a story: son of Alaz, son of Wael, of the Sam clan. In Arabian society, your tribal identity was everything. It determined your allies, your enemies, your honor, and your survival. The Sam clan belonged to the mighty Quraysh tribe, the guardians of Mecca and controllers of its lucrative pilgrimage trade. But within the Quraysh, the Sam were not among the most prestigious families. They were respectable, successful in commerce, but they lived in the shadow of clans like the Hashim and Umayyad, who claimed closer ties to the founding of Mecca and greater shares of its blessed revenue. This secondary status would shape Amr's character in profound ways. From childhood, he learned that in a world where birth determined your starting position, intelligence and cunning could be the great equalizers. He could not rely on inherited prestige. He would have to earn his place through wit, charm, and strategic thinking. Amr's father, Alaz ibn Wael, was a merchant of considerable wealth and influence. He owned camels and trade goods, led caravans across the desert to Syria and Yemen, and had earned respect among the Quraysh for his negotiating skills. But he was also known for his sharp tongue and political maneuvering traits he would pass to his son. From his earliest years, Amr absorbed the lessons of the marketplace and the majlis, the tribal council where disputes were settled and alliances forged. He watched his father navigate the complex web of tribal politics, learning when to speak and when to listen, when to stand firm and when to bend. These were not merely social skills in Arabian society, they were survival techniques. Making of a master diplomat as Amr grew into manhood, his reputation began to eclipse even his father's. While other young men of the Quraysh might focus on poetry competitions or displays of martial prowess, Amr developed an almost supernatural ability to read people and situations. He could walk into a tent full of arguing tribal chiefs, and within minutes identify the real power dynamics, the hidden grievances, and the path to resolution. His contemporaries began calling him Dahi al-Arab, the genius of the Arabs. This was not mere flattery. In a society that prized verbal dexterity and mental agility, Amr stood out as exceptional. He could craft arguments that turned enemies into allies, propose solutions that satisfied competing interests, and navigate the most delicate negotiations without giving offense. But perhaps more importantly, Amr possessed something rarer than intelligence. He had vision. While others focused on immediate tribal concerns, he seemed to understand that larger currents shaping the world. He grasped how the Byzantine-Persian wars were creating opportunities for Arabian merchants. He recognized the potential power in the religious movements stirring in the cities. He saw connections where others saw only chaos. This combination of tactical brilliance and strategic foresight made Amr invaluable to the Quraysh leadership. By his 30s, he was regularly chosen as an ambassador for the most sensitive missions. When the tribe needed to negotiate with the Byzantines in Damascus, they sent Amr. When delicate arrangements had to be made with Yemeni kingdoms, Amr was their envoy. When internal disputes threatened to fracture the Quraysh Confederation, Amr was often the man who found the compromise. The storm clouds gathered, but even as Amr's star rose in traditional Arabian society, forces were gathering that would challenge everything he had built his life upon. In the year 610 AD, when Amr was approaching 40 and at the height of his influence, a man named Muhammad ibn Abdullah began preaching a revolutionary message in the streets of Mecca. Muhammad was not unknown to Amr. He belonged to the Hashim clan of the Quraysh and had earned respect as a trustworthy merchant indeed. His nickname was Al-Amin, the trustworthy one. But his new religious claims struck at the very foundations of Meccan society. He proclaimed that there was only one God, that the traditional idols housed in the Kaaba were false, and that all people, regardless of tribal affiliation, were equal before this divine creator. For the Quraysh elite, including Amr, this message was not just theologically challenging, it was an existential threat. Mecca's economy depended on pilgrimage to the Kaaba and its 360 idols. Thousands of tribesmen came annually to worship their traditional deities and participate in trade fairs. If Muhammad's monotheistic message gained traction, it could destroy the religious and economic system that had made the Quraysh wealthy and powerful. More troubling still, Muhammad's message of equality struck at the tribal hierarchy that formed the basis of Arabian social order. In a world where your clan determined your status, Muhammad preached that a slave could be more righteous than a chief, that piety mattered more than pedigree. This was revolutionary thinking that threatened to overturn the entire structure of Arabian society, the intellectual's dilemma for a man of Amr's intelligence. Muhammad's movement presented a profound dilemma. On an intellectual level, he could see the logical appeal of monotheism. Having traveled widely and negotiated with Byzantine Christians and Persian Zoroastrians, Moreau understood the power and sophistication of monotheistic faiths compared to the somewhat primitive idol worship of pre-Islamic Arabia. He also recognized the political genius of Muhammad's approach. By uniting the fractious Arabian tribes under a single religious banner, Muhammad was creating a source of power that could potentially challenge the great empires to the north and east. Amr, with his strategic mind, could see the revolutionary potential of a unified Arabia, but accepting Muhammad's message would mean abandoning everything Amr had worked to achieve. His wealth, his status, his entire identity was bound up with the traditional system. Moreover, his family and clan expected him to oppose this new movement that threatened their interests. The social pressure to resist Islam was enormous. This internal conflict reveals something crucial about Amr's character. He was a man torn between his intellectual understanding and his material interests, between his vision of what could be and his investment in what was. This tension would define his relationship with Islam for years to come. The resistance forms as Muhammad's following grew. The Quraysh leadership organized systematic opposition. They tried economic pressure, boycotting Muhammad's clan. They attempted social isolation, mocking and ostracizing early converts. They even resorted to physical persecution, though they were careful not to harm Muhammad directly due to his clan. Protection. Amr found himself at the center of these efforts. His diplomatic skills made him invaluable in building coalitions against the new movement. His ability to craft persuasive arguments helped the Quraysh develop their ideological response to Islamic preaching. His connections with other tribes allowed him to build broader opposition networks. Yet even as he worked against Islam, Amr seemed to harbor a grudging respect for Muhammad. Later Islamic sources suggest that he privately acknowledged the Prophet's intelligence and charisma, even while publicly opposing him. His complexity. Fighting against something he partially admired adds depth to Amr's character and helps explain his eventual conversion. The world in flux as the conflict between the traditional Quraysh and the growing Muslim community intensified. The broader world continued its violent transformation. The Byzantine-Persian wars reached new levels of brutality and exhaustion. The Persians captured Jerusalem in 614, carrying away the true cross and dealing a devastating blow to Byzantine prestige. The Byzantines responded with increasingly desperate measures, including the forced conversion of Jews and heavy taxation of their subjects. These distant conflicts had immediate consequences in Arabia. Trade routes were disrupted, affecting Meccan commerce. Refugees and displaced persons brought news of atrocities and upheavals. The sense of a world in crisis permeated Arabian society, creating anxiety but also opportunity for those bold enough to seize it. In Egypt, the jewel that would one day fall to Amr's forces, similar tensions were building. The Byzantine authorities, desperate for resources to fund their wars, had imposed crushing taxes on the Egyptian population. The Coptic Christian majority, already resentful of Byzantine theological domination, groaned under economic oppression. Alexandria, the great center of learning and commerce, struggled to maintain its prosperity as trade networks collapsed and imperial demands increased. All of these factors, religious revolution in Arabia, imperial exhaustion in Byzantium and Persia, and social tensions in Egypt, were creating the conditions for a transformation that would reshape the medieval world. But in the early 610s, few could see the full scope of what was coming. The emotional landscape to understand Amar's eventual transformation from opponent to champion of Islam. We must grasp the emotional climate of this era. This was a time of profound uncertainty, when the old certainties were crumbling and the future seemed frighteningly unpredictable. For established leaders like Amr, there was the fear of losing everything they had worked to build. The traditional system had rewarded their talents and efforts. What would happen to them in a new order? There was also the deeper fear of being on the wrong side of history, proposing a movement that might truly be divinely inspired but alongside. Fear was hope. The tantalizing possibility that this new movement might offer solutions to problems that the old system could not address. The endless tribal warfare, the economic inequality, the spiritual emptiness of idol worship, perhaps. Islam could provide answers. There was also the electric excitement of living through revolutionary times. Even as they opposed it, men like Amr could feel the energy and dynamism of the early Muslim community. Here were people willing to risk everything for their beliefs, who spoke of transforming not just Arabia, but the entire world. For ambitious, intelligent individuals, this was both threatening and irresistibly attractive. The stage is set by 615 AD. The lines were clearly drawn. Muhammad and his followers faced increasing persecution in Mecca, leading to the first migration to Abyssinia. The Quraysh opposition, led by figures like Abu Jahl and including Amr ibn al-As, had hardened into systematic resistance. The stage was set for the conflicts that would determine not just the fate of Islam, but the future of 3 continents. Amr stood at the pinnacle of his success in the old system. Wealthy, respected, influential. He had every reason to oppose the new movement and every incentive to preserve the status quo. Yet history was about to sweep him into a transformation that would turn this master of the old order into an architect of the new. The sands of Arabia were stirring, and the storm that would carry Amr ibn al-As from the councils of Mecca to the conquest of Egypt was about to break upon the world, as we will see. The man who would become known as the conqueror of Egypt was first tested in the crucible of his own conscience, forced to choose between the certainties of the past and the promises of an uncertain future. That choice, when it finally came, would change not just his own destiny, but the course of world history. The stage was set. The players were in position. And in the vast theater of the desert, the greatest drama of the age was about to begin. The weight of opposition in the scorching heat of a Meccan afternoon in 615 AD. Amr ibn al-As stood before the assembled leaders of the Quraysh tribe in the sacred precinct near the Kaaba. The air was thick with incense from the idol shrines and heavy with the weight of momentous decisions. Around him sat the most powerful men in Arabia, Abu Jahl, Abu Sufyan, and other chiefs whose words could determine the fate of thousands. The topic of discussion was always the same these days: Muhammad and his growing band of followers who dared to challenge everything the Quraysh held sacred. The situation has become intolerable, declared Abu Jahl, his voice carrying the authority of his position as one of Mecca's most influential leaders. This man and his followers threaten the very foundations of our society. They mock our gods, reject our traditions, and worst of all, they're convincing others to join their madness. Amr listened carefully, his sharp mind analyzing not just the words but the emotions behind them. He could see the fear in these powerful men's eyes. Not just fear of economic loss, but something deeper, fear of irrelevance. Fear that the world they had mastered was slipping away from them. When his turn came to speak, Amr rose with the fluid grace that had made him famous in the councils of Arabia. His voice carried the confidence of a man who had never lost a debate, never failed to find the right words for any situation. "Muhammad is clever, I'll grant him that," Amr began, his tone measured and analytical. "He's taken the discontent of slaves and the ambitious dreams of merchants and wrapped them in the language of divine revelation. But cleverness is not wisdom, and popularity is not truth." The assembled chiefs nodded approvingly. Amr they knew and trusted logical, pragmatic, unswayed by emotion or sentiment. "Our ancestors built this city on the foundation of the sacred pilgrimage," Amr continued. "The Kaaba draws tribes from across Arabia. They come to honor their gods, to trade, to settle disputes. This system has brought us prosperity and respect for generations. Would we abandon this tested wisdom for the untested promises of one man?" Even as he spoke these words, Amr felt a strange discomfort, as if he were reciting lines in a play rather than expressing his deepest convictions. The logical part of his mind recognized the strength of Muhammad's message. Even as his political instincts demanded opposition, the master of counter-arguments, the Muslim community grew and their message spread. Amr became one of Islam's most formidable intellectual opponents, while others resorted to mockery or persecution. Amr engaged with Islamic theology on its own terms, crafting sophisticated counter-arguments that revealed both his deep understanding of the new faith and his commitment to opposing it. He would challenge early Muslims in public debates, asking pointed questions about the practical implications of their beliefs. If all men are equal before Allah, he would argue, then why do you still follow the leadership of Muhammad? If tribal loyalty is meaningless, then how will society function without the bonds that hold us together? These weren't the crude attacks of men like Abu Jahl who simply dismissed Islam as madness. Amr's criticisms demonstrated a thorough grasp of Islamic principles and their potential consequences. This made him far more dangerous to the early Muslim community than their more obviously hostile enemies. Young Muslims would leave conversations with Amr shaken, not because he had mocked their faith, but because he had forced them to confront questions they hadn't fully considered. His arguments were like surgical instruments, precise and cutting, designed to expose what he saw as the logical flaws in Islamic doctrine. Yet those who knew Amr well began to notice something strange. His arguments against Islam were becoming more sophisticated, more nuanced. He seemed to understand Islamic theology better than many Muslims. Some wondered privately whether his intensive study of the religion he opposed was changing him in ways he didn't fully recognize. The embassy. That changed everything. The turning point in Amr's relationship with Islam came in an unexpected way. In 628 AD, after years of conflict between the Muslims and the Quraysh, a tentative peace was negotiated at Hudaybiyah. The treaty allowed for a 10-year truce and opened the possibility of peaceful interaction between the two communities. As part of the complex diplomatic arrangements that followed, the Quraysh decided to send an embassy to the Negus of Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia. The Christian kingdom had provided refuge to early Muslim immigrants, and the Quraysh hoped to convince the Negus to withdraw his protection and return the Muslim refugees. The choice of ambassador was crucial. This mission required someone with exceptional diplomatic skills, deep knowledge of both Islamic and traditional Arabian arguments, and the respect of foreign rulers. There was only one obvious candidate, Amr Ibn Alaz. Amr accepted the mission with his characteristic confidence. He had negotiated with Byzantine officials, Persian merchants, and tribal chiefs across Arabia. How difficult could it be to convince one African king to abandon his protection of a few refugees? The journey to Abyssinia was long and arduous, but it gave Amr time to think. As his ship sailed across the Red Sea, he found himself reflecting on the Muslims he had met and debated. Over the years, despite his opposition to their cause, he had to admit that many of them possessed qualities he admired: unwavering conviction, moral courage, and a sense of purpose that seemed to transcend personal ambition. The court of the Negus, the Negus in Aksum, was unlike anything Amr had experienced. Here was a Christian kingdom that combined African traditions with Byzantine influences, creating a unique synthesis of cultures. The Negus himself, known to history as Arma or Nayashi, is a ruler of remarkable wisdom and learning. When Amr was granted an audience, he deployed all his considerable rhetorical skills, presented the Quraysh case with eloquence and passion, arguing that the Muslim refugees were dangerous revolutionaries who threatened social order wherever they went. He painted a picture of Islamic doctrine as a threat not just to Arabian traditions, but to all established authority, including Christian kingdoms. But the Negus was not easily swayed. He had met with the Muslim refugees personally and been impressed by their character and sincerity. More importantly, he had heard them recite verses from the Quran about Jesus and Mary that had moved him deeply. "Tell me, Amr of the Quraysh," the Negus said after listening to his arguments, "have you yourself heard these Quranic verses about the Messiah and his mother?" Amr admitted that he had not. As part of diplomatic protocol, the Negus arranged for Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, the leader of the Muslim emigrants, to recite the relevant passages. What happened next would haunt Amr for months afterward. As Ja'far recited the verses about Jesus' miraculous birth, Mary's purity, the divine nature of Christ's mission, Amr felt something shift inside him. The poetry was beautiful, the theology sophisticated, the spiritual power undeniable. The Negus wept openly as he listened. "Truly," he declared, "this and what Jesus brought come from the same source of light." The seeds of doubt Amar's embassy to Abyssinia was a complete failure in political terms. Not only did the Negus refuse to return the Muslim refugees, but he actually converted to Islam himself, though he kept this conversion secret from his Christian subjects. Amr returned to Mecca empty-handed, his reputation as an infallible negotiator damaged for the first time in his career. But the real failure was internal. The confident certainty that had sustained Amr's opposition to Islam had been shaken. He found himself unable to forget the verses he had heard in the Negus' court, unable to dismiss the obvious sincerity of the Muslim emigrants he had met back in Mecca. Amr tried to resume his role as one of Islam's leading opponents, but his heart was no longer fully in it. His arguments became more perfunctory, his debates less passionate. Some of his allies in the Quraysh leadership began to question his commitment to their cause. The internal struggle was tearing Amr apart. His rational mind could see the logical appeal of Islamic monotheism, the moral superiority of Islamic ethics, and the political potential of Islamic unity. But accepting these truths would mean abandoning everything he had built his life upon: his wealth, his status, his relationships, his very identity. Late at night, alone in his house, Amr would sometimes find himself reciting the verses he had heard in Abyssinia. The words seemed to burn in his memory, beautiful and terrible in their clarity. He was a man caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. The point of no return, the final catalyst for Amar's conversion, came in an unexpected encounter. Walking through the markets of Mecca one evening in early 629 AD, he came upon a group of Muslims engaged in their evening prayers. Something about the scene, the perfect synchronization of their movements, the peaceful expressions on their faces, the sense of community that transcended tribal divisions struck him with overwhelming force as he watched these men and women prostrate themselves in submission to Allah. Amr realized that he was witnessing something he had been searching for his entire life without knowing it. A community bound together not by accident of birth or political convenience, but by shared conviction and mutual commitment to something greater than themselves. That night, Amr made his decision. But even then, his conversion was calculated and strategic rather than purely emotional. He chose to convert alongside Khalid ibn Walid, another prominent Meccan who had also become convinced of Islam's truth. By converting together, they could provide mutual support and demonstrate that their decision was based on careful consideration rather than momentary weakness. The two men traveled to Medina, where they were personally welcomed by the Prophet Muhammad. The moment when Amr knelt to declare his Shahada, "There is no God but Allah, Muhammad is his messenger," marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. The price of transformation converting to Islam transformed Amr from one of the community's most dangerous enemies into one of its most valuable assets. His diplomatic skills, his deep knowledge of Arabian politics, and his reputation for strategic thinking made him immediately useful to the growing Islamic State. But the personal cost was enormous. Many of his oldest friends and closest allies felt betrayed by his conversion. They saw it not as a sincere religious transformation, but as opportunistic calculation, a conclusion that wasn't entirely wrong, though it missed the deeper spiritual struggle that had preceded his decision. His relationship with his father, Al-As ibn Wa'il, became particularly strained. The old man had spent decades building the family's reputation and wealth within the traditional system. Now his son had abandoned everything they had worked for, joining a movement that threatened to destroy their entire way of life. "You have traded your birthright for the promises of a madman," his father reportedly told him. "You were a leader among the Quraysh, respected and feared. Now you are just another follower in Muhammad's crowd." These words cut deeply because Amir knew there was some truth in them. In the traditional Arabian system, he had been unique, irreplaceable. In the Islamic community, he was just one talented individual among many. The conversion that had brought him spiritual peace had also cost him his distinctive position in society. The test of loyalty Muhammad, with his characteristic insight into human nature, understood both the value and the vulnerability of converts like Amr. He knew that men who had given up so much to join Islam might also be tempted to abandon it if the costs became too high too. Test Amr's commitment and demonstrate his trust, the Prophet assigned him increasingly important responsibilities. First came diplomatic missions to neighboring tribes, where Amr's reputation and skills could help expand the Islamic coalition. Then came military commands, where his strategic acumen could be put to direct use in defending the growing Muslim state. Each successful mission strengthened Amr's position within the Islamic community and demonstrated that his conversion had brought practical benefits as well as spiritual ones. But it also deepened the gulf between him and his former life. Every victory for Islam was a defeat for the traditional Arabian system he had. Once championed, the psychological complexity of Amar's situation was extraordinary. He had become one of Islam's most effective advocates, but he carried within himself an intimate knowledge of its weaknesses and limitations. He believed in the faith he had embraced, but he also understood better than most the sacrifices it demanded and the resistance it would face. The man reborn by 630 AD, as the Muslim community prepared for the conquest of Mecca that would effectively end organized opposition to Islam in Arabia, Amr had completed his transformation from reluctant convert to trusted commander. His past as an opponent had become an asset, providing him with insights into enemy thinking that few other Muslim leaders possessed. But the scars of his conversion remained. In quiet moments, those who knew him well could see the sadness in his eyes, the grief of a man who had lost one identity without completely finding another. He had gained a faith and a cause, but he had also lost the easy certainties of his youth and the simple loyalties of tribal life. This complexity would define Amar's character for the rest of his life. He would become one of Islam's greatest champions and most successful generals, but he would never lose the analytical detachment of someone who had chosen his allegiances rather than inherited them. This combination of passionate commitment and intellectual distance would make him uniquely suited for the greatest challenge of his career, the conquest of a land as ancient and complex as Egypt itself, as he prepared for the campaigns that would carry Islamic armies beyond the Arabian Peninsula for the first time. Amr carried within himself all the contradictions of the age. He was a man of the old world who had helped birth the new, a former enemy who had become a devoted servant, pragmatist who had embraced idealism. The reluctant convert had become a willing instrument of conquest, but the pain of that transformation would stay with him forever. Perhaps that pain was necessary for only someone who understood the true cost of change could successfully impose it on others. The sands of Arabia had tested and transformed Amr ibn Alaz. Now it was time for him to help transform the world. The transformation begins the year 629 AD in the oasis city of Medina. A man approaches the simple house of the Prophet Muhammad with measured steps. This is not the confident stride of the old Amr ibn Alaz, the master diplomat of Mecca who once commanded respect through tribal prestige and silver tongue. This is something different, the careful gait of a man who has shed one identity and is still learning to wear another. Just months after his conversion to Islam, Amr faces the ultimate test of his transformation. The Prophet has called upon him not merely as a new believer, but as a leader. The irony is profound. The man who once plotted against Islam is now being entrusted with its military expansion. But Muhammad, with the wisdom that had already transformed Arabia, recognizes that Amr's opposition had been born not from weakness, but from strength. The very qualities that made him a formidable enemy would make him an invaluable ally. One who knows the path of error, Muhammad had said, is best suited to guide others away from it. Baptism by fire. The Muta campaign, Amr's first major test, comes sooner than anyone expected. In September 629 AD, devastating news reaches Medina. A Muslim army of 3,000 men, sent to confront Byzantine forces in Jordan, has been annihilated at the Battle of Muta. Khalid ibn al-Wal, the brilliant cavalry commander, had managed to save the remnants of the force through a masterful tactical withdrawal. But the psychological impact was crushing. The Muslim community is shaken. For the first time since the early days of persecution, Islam faces the possibility of military collapse. The Byzantines, emboldened by their victory, are mobilizing a massive retaliatory force. Tribal allies are reconsidering their loyalties. In the markets of Medina, whispers question whether Allah has abandoned his followers. Into this crisis steps the Prophet Muhammad with a decision that surprises everyone, including Omar himself. Rather than sending Khalid ibn al-Walid or another established military commander, Kay assigns Amr to lead a new expedition to the very region where the Muslims had just suffered their greatest defeat. But Prophet of Allah, one of the companions, objects. Amr has never commanded a major military campaign. Muhammad's response reveals his profound understanding of human nature. Sometimes the mind of a strategist is more valuable than the sword of a warrior. Amr sees the battlefield differently than others. He sees not just the enemy in front of him, but the one that might attack from behind, and the one that hasn't been born yet. The mind of a master's Omer prepares for his first independent command. We glimpse the intellectual processes that would make him one of history's most successful generals. While other commanders focus on traditional metrics, troop numbers, weapon quality, terrain advantages, Amer's approach is fundamentally psychological. He begins by studying not just the enemy's military capabilities, abilities, fears, and internal divisions. The Byzantines, he realizes, are not a monolithic force. Syrian Arab allies fight for pay and plunder, not ideology. Their regular troops are far from home, exhausted by endless campaigns against Persia. Their commanders are under enormous pressure from Constantinople to achieve quick, decisive victories. Most importantly, Amr understands something that many military leaders miss. The battle begins long before the armies meet. In the weeks leading up to his expedition, he launches what we might today call a psychological warfare campaign. Through carefully planted rumors, diplomatic contacts, and strategic demonstrations of force, he begins to undermine enemy morale. Before a single sword is drawn, a battle won without fighting, he tells his officers, quoting an ancient Arab maxim, is worth 10 battles won with blood. This philosophical approach extends to his treatment of his own forces. Unlike many commanders who rule through fear and rigid discipline, Amr cultivates loyalty through respect and shared understanding. He explains his strategies to his officers, seeks their input, and ensures that every man understands not just what they are fighting for, but why their particular role matters. The campaign that changed everything. The expedition that follows becomes a masterclass in military psychology. Rather than marching directly toward the Byzantine strongholds, Amr takes an indirect route that serves multiple purposes. First, it allows him to gather intelligence about enemy positions and intentions. Second, it demonstrates two potential, allies and enemies alike, that the Muslims are not retreating in defeat, but advancing with confidence. Most brilliantly, Amr uses the journey itself as a weapon. His forces move in a pattern that suggests a much larger army camping in multiple locations, lighting extra fires, sending out numerous scouting parties. Byzantine intelligence reports reaching Damascus speak of a massive Muslim force, far larger than the actual 300 men under Amr's command. When the campaign culminates in several sharp skirmishes along the Jordan River, Amr's psychological preparation pays dividends. The Byzantine Arab allies, already demoralized by intelligence reports of overwhelming Muslim numbers, fight half-heartedly. Several tribal contingents switch sides mid-battle. Regular Byzantine troops, expecting a desperate last standby. Defeated enemies instead face confident, well-coordinated opponents who seem to anticipate their every move. The results exceed all expectations. Not only does Amr's force avoid the disaster that many predicted, they actually advance Muslim control deeper into Byzantine territory. More importantly, the psychological impact reverses the damage from Mu'tah. Word spreads throughout Arabia that the Muslims are not weakened, stronger than ever. The diplomat and armor-butt Amr's greatest innovation during this campaign is his integration of diplomacy with military action. While his forces engage Byzantine troops in the field, he simultaneously conducts a parallel campaign of negotiation and alliance building with local populations. This dual approach reflects Amr's unique understanding of conquest as more than mere military victory. Its true control, he recognizes, requires the consent, or at least the acquiescence of the governed. Populations that welcome Muslim rule will provide intelligence, supplies, and recruits. Those that resist will drain resources and require constant garrison forces. His diplomatic efforts during the Jordan campaign become a template for later conquests. He offers generous terms to communities that surrender peacefully, protection of property, religious freedom for Christians and Jews, and local autonomy in exchange for tribute. But he also demonstrates that resistance will be met with overwhelming force. "I come not as a destroyer," he tells a delegation from a Syrian town, "but as a liberator. The Byzantines have taxed you into poverty and conscripted your sons for their endless wars. We offer you peace, prosperity, and the protection of Allah. Choose wisely." The effectiveness of this approach is immediately apparent. Town after town opens its gates without resistance. Local populations provide intelligence about Byzantine movements. Some even contribute guides and supplies to the Muslim advance. The burden of command, even as Amr's reputation grows. Those closest to him observe the personal cost of his new responsibilities. The man who once thrived on the cut and thrust of Meccan politics now carries the weight of decisions that determine life and death for hundreds of men. His nephew, who serves as his aide-de-camp, later recalls watching Amr during the long desert nights of the campaign. While his men slept, their commander would sit alone, studying maps by firelight, calculating supplies, analyzing intelligence reports. But more than tactical planning, these solitary hours seemed devoted to a deeper contemplation. It carried every man's life on his shoulders. The nephew remembers. Before each battle, he would review the names of all our fighters, as if memorizing them. After each engagement, he would personally visit the wounded, whether they were under his direct command or not. I began to understand that leadership in Islam was not about glory or personal advancement, but about service to something greater than oneself. This emotional evolution is crucial to understanding Amr's later success. Unlike commanders who view their troops as expendable resources, he develops a paternal relationship with his forces. This creates an extraordinary level of loyalty, but also an almost crushing sense of responsibility. The psychological pressure becomes evident. During a particularly difficult siege of a Byzantine fortress near the Dead Sea, for 3 days, Amr's forces probe the defenses, seeking a weakness that will allow them to take the position without heavy casualties. Other commanders might order a direct assault, accepting losses as inevitable. But Amor cannot bring himself to sacrifice his men for the sake of speed. On the third night, his officers find him prostrate in prayer, tears streaming down his face. "O Allah," he whispers, "show me a path that preserves the lives you have entrusted to me." The next morning, he devises a stratagem involving a feigned retreat that draws the defenders out of their fortress, allowing the Muslims to take it with minimal casualties, the ruthless necessities, however. Kamer's compassion for his own forces is balanced by a calculating ruthlessness toward enemies who refuse his terms. During the same campaign, a Byzantine garrison massacres a group of Muslim messengers sent under a flag of truce. Amer's response is swift and merciless. They have chosen to fight outside the rules of civilized warfare, he announces to his assembled forces. Therefore, they forfeit the protections those rules provide. The siege that follows becomes a lesson in the consequences of treachery. Amr employs every psychological and physical weapon at his disposal. He cuts off the fortress's water supply, then allows the defenders to see his men drinking freely from nearby wells. He arranges for the sounds of celebration from his camp to carry to the besieged garrison, suggesting that reinforcements have arrived. Most devastatingly, he uses captured enemy correspondence to create fake messages, suggesting that Constantinople has abandoned the garrison. When the fortress finally falls, Amor's treatment of the survivors is harsh but calculated.
The officer.
Who ordered the massacre of the messengers are executed publicly. The regular soldiers are enslaved, but the local civilians who had been forced to support the garrison are pardoned and offered the same. Generous terms extended to other conquered populations. This combination of mercy and severity becomes another hallmark of Amr's approach. He demonstrates that cooperation brings rewards while treachery results in destruction. The psychological impact extends far beyond the immediate battlefield. Word of his policy spreads throughout the region, encouraging surrender, while discouraging resistance, the strategic mind at work perhaps the most revealing glimpse into Amr's mental processes comes from his handling of intelligence during the Jordan campaign. Rather than relying solely on military scouts, he creates an informal network of merchants, travelers, and local contacts who provide information about enemy movements, political developments, and economic conditions. More impressively, he demonstrates an intuitive understanding of what modern military theorists call intelligence analysis. Raw information is useless without interpretation. And AMR shows a remarkable skill at synthesizing disparate facts into coherent strategic pictures. When reports reach him of Persian victories against the Byzantines in the east, he immediately recognizes the implications for his own campaign. Byzantine forces in Syria will likely be reduced as troops are shifted to the Persian front, but he also realizes that a weakened Byzantine position might make them more desperate, potentially, leading to more aggressive tactics. His response demonstrates strategic thinking several moves ahead. He accelerates his own timeline, seeking to capture key positions before the Byzantines can reorganize. But he also prepares contingency plans for dealing with desperate counterattacks. When the expected Byzantine response comes, his forces are ready. The teacher emerges, the campaign progresses. Amr begins to display another quality that will serve him well in Egypt: the ability to develop other leaders. Several of his junior officers during the Jordan expedition will later become renowned commanders in their own right. They consistently credit Amr with their development. His teaching method is remarkably modern, rather than simply issuing Orders. He explains his reasoning, involves subordinates in planning, creates opportunities for them to exercise independent judgment. After each engagement, he conducts what we might today call after-action reviews, analyzing what worked, what didn't, and why. General who fights every battle himself, he tells his officers, is a general who will lose the war. My job is not to be the best fighter in the army, but to create an army where every man fights better than he thought possible. This philosophy extends beyond military tactics to encompass the broader goals of Islamic expansion. Amr consistently emphasizes that their mission is not merely conquest, but the creation of a new social order based on justice, equality, and submission to Allah. His officers are not just military commanders, but future administrators of conquered territories, the forge of leadership. By the time Amr's forces return to Medina in early 630 AD, they bring more than military victory. They carry with them a new model of Islamic leadership, one that combines strategic brilliance with tactical flexibility, ruthless determination with compassionate governance, and individual excellence with collective development. The Prophet Muhammad's satisfaction with the campaign is evident in his public praise for Amr, but more significantly, it becomes clear that this expedition has been a kind of advanced training for greater responsibilities to come. The lessons learned in the valleys of Jordan about psychology and strategy, it's about leadership and governance, about the integration of military and political objectives, will soon be applied on a far grander scale as Amr dismounts in the STR. Streets of Medina, dusty and tired but victorious. He is no longer the uncertain convert seeking to prove his loyalty. He has become something new, a strategic mind honed by experience, a leader tested by responsibility, a weapon forged in the fires of command. The man who will conquer Egypt is taking shape. But first, there are other lessons to learn, other battles to fight, and other aspects of leadership to master. The transformation continues, but the foundation has been laid in the councils of Medina. As the Prophet and his companions plan the next phase of Islamic expansion, a new voice carries special weight. When Amr ibn Allah speaks of strategy and conquest, of diplomacy and governance, men listen with the respect due to proven excellence. The strategist has emerged. Now, history will test just how far his brilliance can carry the banner of Islam. The prize beyond dreams. In the chambers of Medina, the fate of nations was decided by men in simple robes. Amr ibn Allah's stood before a map that would have made emperors weep with envy. Drawn on parchment by Byzantine cartographers and captured during the conquest of Syria, it showed Egypt in all its impossible glory, a ribbon of green cutting through golden desert. Crowned by Alexandria, the greatest city in the Mediterranean world. But this was not merely geography. This was power incarnate. Egypt was the jewel that had made Rome an empire and kept Byzantium alive. Its wheat-fed Constantinople's million inhabitants. Its gold-filled imperial treasuries. Its strategic position controlled the sea routes between Europe, Asia, and Africa. For over 3,000 years, whoever ruled Egypt possessed the key to the ancient world's economy. As Amr traced the Nile's path with his finger, he was not just studying a map, he was contemplating the greatest gamble in Islamic history. Syria had been conquered, bringing the young Muslim empire to Egypt's borders. Now, with Byzantine forces reeling and Persian resistance crumbling, The question that haunted every strategic mind in Medina was simple. Could they dare to reach for the ultimate prize? The economics of empire, to understand why Egypt commanded? Such reverence, one must grasp the brutal mathematics of ancient economics. The Roman Empire at its height consumed 6 million tons of grain annually. Egypt alone provided 1/3 of this supply, 2 million tons of wheat that flowed down the Nile, crossed the Mediterranean, and into the granaries of Rome and Constantinople. This was not merely about food. Control of Egypt's grain meant control over the survival of entire populations. When Egypt's harvests failed, riots erupted in Constantinople. When Egyptian grain ships were delayed, bread prices soared across the empire. The ruler of Egypt held the power of life and death over millions of people who had never seen the Nile, but grain was only the beginning. Egypt's other treasures read like an inventory of divine blessings. The gold mines of the eastern desert had enriched pharaohs and emperors for millennia. The papyrus marshes of the delta provided the writing material that enabled imperial bureaucracy. The strategic harbors of Alexandria commanded maritime trade routes that connected 3 continents. Perhaps most valuable of all was Egypt's position as a cultural crossroads. Here, Greek philosophy met African wisdom, Christian theology encountered, ancient Egyptian mysticism, and Persian merchants traded with Roman aristocrats. The great library of Alexandria, though diminished from its legendary heights, still contained more books than existed in all of Arabia combined. For the growing Islamic Empire, Egypt represented not just wealth, but legitimacy. To rule Egypt was to join the ranks of history's greatest powers, to stand equal with the Caesars and pharaohs who had made this land the foundation of their glory, Amirs. Vision in the councils of Medina, while other commanders spoke of consolidating. Gains in Syria or pushing deeper into Mesopotamia, Amr ibn al-As harbored a more audacious dream. He saw Egypt not as a distant prize, but as the inevitable next step in Islam's expansion. The key that would unlock North Africa and establish Muslim power in the Mediterranean forever. His arguments were masterful combinations of strategic logic and emotional appeal. "O commander of the faithful," he would say to Caliph Umar, "Egypt is the treasure house of the world. Its wealth could fund our armies for generations. Its grain could feed our people through any famine. Its position would give us command of the sea routes that bind the known world together." But Amar's lobbying went deeper than mere economics. He understood that Egypt represented a psychological victory that would shatter Byzantine morale and demonstrate Islamic power to the world. When Constantinople learns that Egypt has fallen, he argued, they will know that Allah has abandoned them. Their remaining provinces will crumble like sand castles before the tide. Yet behind Amar's public arguments lay private motivations that were more complex and personal. This was a man who had spent his life navigating the intersection of ambition and duty, personal glory, and religious mission. Did he seek Egypt for Islam, or did Islam provide him with the vehicle for his own imperial dreams? The truth, as with all great historical figures, was probably both. Amr genuinely believed in the Islamic mission and saw Egypt's conquest as divinely ordained. But he also craved the immortal glory that would come from achieving what no Arabian leader had ever attempted: the conquest of the ancient world's greatest prize. The reluctant caliph across from Amr in these strategic debates sat Umar ibn al-Khattab, the formidable second caliph of Islam, a man whose austere simplicity masked one of history's most sophisticated strategic minds. Where Amr saw opportunity, Umar saw danger. Where Amr projected confidence, Umar calculated risks. Umar's concerns were not unfounded. The Muslim armies were already stretched thin across a vast front from Syria to Iraq. Egypt would require crossing hundreds of miles of hostile desert, then confronting fortifications that had resisted conquest for centuries. The Byzantine forces in Egypt, while weakened, still numbered in the tens of thousands and were led by experienced commanders who knew the terrain intimately. More troubling still was the logistical nightmare. How could an Arabian army, accustomed to the mobility of desert warfare, conduct the prolonged sieges that Egyptian fortresses would require? How could they maintain supply lines across such distances while simultaneously fighting a determined enemy? Amr Umar would respond during their lengthy debates. You speak of Egypt as if it were merely another Syrian city. But this is the fortress that has protected Byzantine power for 3 centuries. Its walls have never fallen to Eastern armies. Its defenders include the finest soldiers in the empire. You so certain that Allah wills us to attempt the impossible? These were not merely military concerns, but profound questions about the nature of Islamic expansion itself. Should the young empire consolidate its remarkable gains? Or should it continue the breathtaking pace of conquest that had already stunned the world? Was caution, wisdom, or faithlessness? Was audacity, courage, or recklessness? The art of persuasion, understanding that direct pressure would fail with a man like Umar? Amr employed the subtle arts of influence that had made him legendary among the Arabs. Rather than continuing to advocate for immediate invasion, he began a more sophisticated campaign of psychological preparation. He arranged for Syrian merchants who had traded in Alexandria to speak before the Caliph about Egypt's wealth and the weakness of its defenses. He ensured that reports from border scouts emphasized the demoralization of Byzantine forces and the discontent among Egypt's Coptic Christian population. He sponsored delegations of Arab tribal leaders who spoke passionately about the glory that would come from conquering the land of the pharaohs most cleverly. Amr began to frame the Egyptian campaign not as aggressive expansion but as defensive necessity. O commander of the faithful, he argued, as long as Egypt remains in Byzantine hands, our hold on Syria remains precarious. From Alexandria, they can launch fleets to reconquer Palestine. From the Delta, they can fund armies to reclaim Damascus. We cannot truly possess Syria until we control Egypt. This argument proved particularly persuasive because it contained undeniable truth. Byzantine naval power, based in Alexandria and Constantinople, did pose a real threat to Muslim control of the Levantine coast. Egyptian wealth could indeed fund future attempts at reconquest. From a purely defensive standpoint, neutralizing Egypt made strategic sense the moment of decision. The breakthrough came during a private conversation between Amr and Umar in the Umar. Early months of 639 AD, the exact words were never recorded. But later Islamic historians suggest that Amr finally found the argument that moved the cautious caliph, an appeal not to ambition, but to faith. Commander of the faithful, Amr reportedly said, I have dreamed 3 times of standing in the shadow of the pyramids, reading the Quran to assembled multitudes of believers. Allah did not intend us to bring his message to Egypt. Why would he plant such visions in the mind of his servant? Whether Amr actually experienced such dreams, whether this was another masterpiece of persuasion, remains debated by historians. But the effect was decisive. Umar, a man who took divine signs seriously, began to soften his opposition. The final agreement was characteristically cautious. Umar would permit a limited probe, not a full invasion, but a reconnaissance in force that could be recalled if conditions proved unfavorable. Amr would lead no more than 4,000 men on what was officially described as an extended raid rather than a conquest. But both men understood the reality behind this diplomatic language. Wars have their own momentum. Once Amr's forces crossed into Egypt, the logic of events would drive them forward toward decisive confrontation. This limited probe was actually the opening gambit in a campaign that would end either in glorious triumph or catastrophic defeat. The secret. Preparations with Umar's reluctant permission secured, Omar began the delicate process of preparing for the most ambitious military operation in Islamic history. Every aspect of the preparations had to be conducted with utmost secrecy. Byzantine spies were known to operate throughout Syria, and premature discovery of the Egyptian plans could allow the enemy to prepare devastating countermeasures. The recruitment process alone presented enormous challenges. Amr needed men who combined desert mobility with siege warfare capabilities, who could endure the harsh conditions of the Sinai, crossing while maintaining the discipline necessary for prolonged military operations. He could not simply issue general calls for volunteers, as this would immediately alert Byzantine intelligence networks. Instead, Amr relied on personal relationships and tribal loyalties built over decades of diplomatic service. He approached trusted clan leaders privately, explaining the magnitude of the opportunity and the glory that would come to tribes that provided the finest warriors. He appealed to veterans of the Syrian campaigns, men who had tasted victory and craved greater triumphs. The logistical preparations were equally complex. An army crossing the Sinai would need water supplies carefully cached along the route. It would require siege equipment that could be transported across desert terrain. Most critically, they would need intelligence about Egyptian defenses, gathered through networks of merchants and travelers who could move freely across the border. Amr spent months cultivating Coptic Christian merchants who traveled between Syria and Egypt. These men, often resentful of Byzantine taxation and religious persecution, proved valuable sources of information about garrison strengths, fortification conditions, and political tensions within Egypt. Some even agreed to serve as guides when the invasion began. The men who would make history. The force that assembled in southern Syria during the summer of 639 AD represented the cream of Arabian military leadership. Amr had handpicked his commanders not just for their battlefield skills, but for their loyalty and discretion. These were men who understood that they were embarking on a mission that would either crown their careers with immortal glory or end them in ignominious defeat. His lieutenant commanders read like a roster of Islamic military legends. There was Sharik ibn Sumay, veteran of the Rita Wars, whose tactical brilliance had crushed tribal rebellions across Arabia. Abdullah ibn Amr, not just a skilled warrior, but one of the most learned men in the army, whose knowledge of Christian theology would prove invaluable in dealing with Egypt's Coptic population. Perhaps most important was Uqba ibn Nafi, a young officer whose combination of religious zeal and military talent marked him as a future leader of Islamic expansion. Under Amr's mentorship, Uqba would later lead the conquest of North Africa, carrying Islamic armies to the Atlantic shores of Morocco. But the backbone of the force consisted of Bedouin warriors from the great tribes of Central Arabia, men who had grown up on camelback, who could navigate by stars, and who viewed the upcoming campaign not just as military service, but as the adventure of their lifetimes. These were the sons and grandsons of men who had followed the Prophet in the early battles of Islam. Warriors who carried the memory of Badr and Uhud in their hearts, the psychology of Firaz. Word of the impending mission spread among the assembled troops. Reactions varied dramatically. The younger warriors, especially those who had not participated in the Syrian campaigns, bubbled with excitement at the prospect of conquering the legendary land of Egypt. They spoke of returning home with Byzantine gold, stories they would tell their grandchildren about the day they stood in the shadow of the pyramids. But among the more experienced soldiers, a different mood prevailed. These were men who had seen enough warfare to understand the difference between raiding and conquest, between defeating tribal armies in open desert and besieging fortified cities defended by professional soldiers. They knew that Egypt would test them in ways that previous campaigns had not. The fear was not of death. Arabian culture had long celebrated the warrior's death in battle as the path to honor. Rather, it was fear of failure, of returning home having achieved nothing, of being remembered as the generation that overreached, and broke the string of Islamic victories that had made their people the wonder of the world. These concerns were not openly discussed, as Arabian military culture discouraged expressions of doubt. But Amr, with his keen understanding of human psychology, could see the tension in his men's faces, hear it in their muted conversations around evening campfires. He knew that managing this anxiety would be as crucial to the campaign's success as any tactical decision. His solution was characteristically subtle. Rather than delivering rousing speeches about certain victory, Amr began to share stories of great challenges overcome through faith and persistence. He reminded his men of the impossible odds faced by early Muslims at Badr, where 300 believers had defeated 1,000 Meccan warriors. He spoke of the conquest of Damascus, where Muslim armies had taken a city that had never fallen to Arabian forces. Most importantly, he emphasized that they were not attempting conquest through their own strength alone, but as instruments of divine will. "We do not go to Egypt as mere raiders seeking plunder," he told his assembled commanders. "We go as bearers of Allah's message to a people who have waited centuries for liberation from oppression. Our victory is assured not by our swords, but by the righteousness of our cause." The first steps into legend, a moonless night in December 639 AD, as winter winds swept across the Syrian desert, Amr ibn al-As led his small army southward toward the Egyptian frontier. They moved in small groups to avoid detection, following routes known only to Bedouin guides who had trafficked across these borders for generations. The men carried minimal supplies, each warrior responsible for his own weapons, water, and provisions for several days. They rode hardy Arabian horses and camels, capable of covering vast distances without rest. Everything about their equipment and organization emphasized speed and mobility over conventional military power. As they approached the Sinai Peninsula, the psychological weight of their mission began to settle over the army. Behind them lay Syria, recently conquered, but now familiar territory. Ahead stretched the unknown trackless wastes that had swallowed armies before, and beyond that, the greatest prize in the ancient world, the border crossing itself, was almost anticlimactic. No trumpets sounded, no banners flew, no speeches marked the moment. In the pre-dawn darkness, Amr's army simply walked across an invisible line in the sand and found themselves in Egyptian territory, the first Arabian force ever to set foot in the land of the pharaohs with conquest as their goal. But even as they achieved this historic milestone, the magnitude of their challenge was becoming clear. Ahead lay hundreds of miles of desert before they would reach the Nile Valley. Behind them, their supply lines stretched back to Syria across terrain that could easily be cut by Byzantine forces. They were now committed to a course that would end either in triumph or disaster, with no middle ground possible. As the sun rose over the Sinai on that December morning, casting long shadows across the ancient landscape, Amr ibn Allah's and his 4,000 warriors began the march that would determine whether the Islamic Empire would become a Mediterranean power or remain forever confined to the Arabian Peninsula. The road to Egypt lay open before them, but it was a road that led through uncertainty, danger, and the greatest gamble in the history of their young faith. Behind them lay the familiar world of tribal Arabia. Ahead lay the unknown challenge of conquering a civilization older than memory itself. Die was cast as the march had begun, and history held its breath to see whether this small band of desert warriors could achieve what the greatest conquerors of antiquity had only dreamed of: the conquest of Egypt in the name of a new faith in a new world order. The fortress that defied empires in the spring of 640 AD as the floodwaters of the Nile began their annual retreat. Amr ibn Allah stood on a rocky outcrop, overlooking the most formidable fortress in Egypt. Before him rose the massive walls of Babylon, not the legendary city of Mesopotamia, but its Egyptian namesake, a Byzantine stronghold that commanded the narrow passage where the Nile Delta began. This was no ordinary fortress. Babylon's walls were 20 feet thick, built from massive limestone blocks, quarried from the cliffs of nearby Mokattam. 4 great towers anchored its defenses, each one a castle in its own right, bristling with ballistae and catapults. The fortress controlled the vital canal that connected the Nile to the Red Sea, making it the economic jugular of Egypt. More importantly, it guarded the road to Alexandria, the path to Egypt's heart. For 3 centuries, Babylon had been the symbol of Byzantine power in Egypt. Roman legions had first fortified this site, and their successors had expanded it into an impregnable citadel. Persian armies had broken against these walls. Bedouin raiders had been crushed beneath its battlements. Local rebellions had withered under the gaze of its sentries. Now, with barely 4,000 men, Amr proposed to take what had never been taken: the defenders' confidence inside those massive walls. Cyrus, the Byzantine commander known as Al-Muqawqis, to the Arabs prepared for what he assumed would be a brief siege, Cyrus was no ordinary general. He served dual roles as both military commander and patriarch of the Coptic Church, making him the most powerful man in Egypt outside of Alexandria itself. His political acumen matched his military experience. He had spent months preparing for the Arab invasion. The fortress housed nearly 5,000 crack Byzantine troops, Marines from the Imperial Fleet, armored cavalry from Anatolia, and experienced siege engineers who had fought the Persians. More importantly, Babylon's granaries bulged with grain. Its cisterns overflowed with Nile water. Its armories contained enough weapons to outfit an army. Cyrus had every reason for confidence. He had studied the Arab campaigns in Syria and Palestine, noting their preference for rapid movement and their weakness in prolonged sieges. His spies reported that Amr's force was small, lacking heavy siege equipment and composed largely of Bedouin cavalry, ill-suited for the grinding work of reducing fortifications. "Let them come," Cyrus reportedly told his officers during a council of war. "The desert fighters who frightened peasant militias in Palestine will learn the difference between raiding villages and storming Roman walls." But Cyrus had made a crucial miscalculation. He had underestimated not just Amr's military capabilities, but his psychological warfare and the hidden fractures within Egyptian society that the Arab commander was already exploiting: the web of espionage before the first Arab soldier appeared before Babylon's walls. Amr had been fighting a different kind of battle, one waged in shadows, in whispered conversations, in the careful cultivation of discontent. For months, his agents had been working throughout Egypt, and nowhere was their influence more crucial than within the fortress itself. The key to Amr's intelligence network lay in Egypt's complex religious and ethnic divisions. The majority of Egyptians were Coptic Christians who had been systematically oppressed by their Byzantine rulers. Constantinople followed the Orthodox doctrine established at the Council of Chalcedon, which declared Christ to have two natures, human and divine. The Copts, however, were monophysites, believing in Christ's single divine nature. This theological difference might seem abstract, but its consequences were brutally real. Byzantine authorities had spent decades trying to force the Copts to accept Chalcedonian doctrine. Coptic bishops had been exiled, monasteries closed, and believers tortured. The very man now defending Babylon. Cyrus had earned his appointment partly through his promises to bring the Copts into Orthodox conformity. By force if necessary, Amr, with his gift for reading human nature, had immediately grasped the opportunity this presented. His agents spread word throughout Egypt that the Arabs had no interest in forcing religious conversion, that Christians would be free to worship as they chose under Islamic rule. More practically, they promised that the crushing Byzantine taxes would be reduced, that Coptic priests would be allowed to return from exile, that the ancient Egyptian identity suppressed by Constantinople would be respected. Within Babylon itself, these messages found eager listeners. The fortress garrison included many locally recruited troops, Egyptians who served Byzantine masters but harbored deep resentments. Coptic craftsmen maintained the fortress's infrastructure. Egyptian servants moved freely through its corridors. Even some of the Syrian and Armenian soldiers in Byzantine service had their own grievances against Constantinople's policies. Through this network, Amr gained detailed intelligence about Babylon's defenses, supply situation, and internal tensions. More importantly, he began to plant seeds of doubt and division that would prove as effective as any battering ram. The siege begins on a scorching morning in May 640, as the Arab army finally appeared before Babylon's walls. To the defenders, watching from the battlements, they must have seemed an unimpressive force. Desert riders on camel and horseback, carrying simple weapons and lacking any visible siege engines. Cyrus himself climbed the highest tower to observe. The enemy and contemporary accounts suggest he felt his confidence confirmed. But Amr had not come to fight a conventional siege. Instead, he began what modern military theorists would recognize as a campaign of psychological and economic warfare. Designed to strangle the fortress rather than storm it, his first move was to cut Babylon's connections to the outside world. Arab cavalry swept across the delta, severing supply lines and communication routes. River traffic on the Nile was intercepted. Messenger pigeons were shot down by skilled Arab archers. Within days, the mighty fortress found itself isolated in a sea of Arab-controlled territory. More insidiously, Ammar began spreading disinformation designed to demoralize the defenders. His agents, some already within the fortress, circulated stories of Arab victories elsewhere in Egypt, of Alexandria's fall, which had not yet occurred, of massive reinforcements arriving from Arabia. They whispered that resistance was futile. Cyrus had been abandoned by Constantinople. The emperor himself was preparing to make peace with the caliph. The psychological pressure was carefully calibrated. Ammar made no immediate attacks. On the walls, allowing tension to build, his men remained visible but just out of catapult range. A constant reminder of the siege without providing targets for frustrated defenders. At night, they would light countless fires, creating the illusion of a vast army camping in the darkness. The art of Division A's summer deepened, and the siege continued. Ammar's most sophisticated strategy began to bear fruit. The deliberate exploitation of ethnic and religious divisions within the fortress. His network of sympathizers worked to amplify existing tensions between Orthodox and Coptic Christians, between Byzantine officers and locally recruited troops, between different ethnic groups. Within the garrison, the process was subtle but devastatingly effective. A Coptic craftsman might accidentally mention two Egyptian soldiers that Arab prisoners spoke respectfully of Christ and the Virgin Mary. A Syrian auxiliary might hear rumors that Constantinople was planning to abandon Egypt entirely in Armenia. Archer might learn that his cousins in Armenia had made favorable terms with the Arabs. These whispers were carefully orchestrated to create doubt without appearing coordinated. Ammar understood that obvious propaganda would be dismissed, but information that seemed to come from trusted sources within the garrison carried its enormous weight. The campaign reached its climax when one of Cyrus's own officers, a man named John, whose family had suffered under Orthodox persecution, made secret contact with the Arabs. Through intermediaries, he offered to provide detailed intelligence about the fortress's weaknesses in exchange for guarantees about Christian rights under Islamic rule. This breakthrough gave Ammar precise information about guard rotations, supply levels, and internal morale. More importantly, it demonstrated that even Cyrus's inner circle was not immune to doubt and division. The tightening noose as autumn arrived. The effects of Ammar's strategy became impossible to ignore. Supply shortages, initially manageable, began to bite seriously. The fortress's granaries, while extensive, had not been stocked for a siege of such duration. Water remained adequate thanks to deep wells and Nile access, but other necessities grew scarce. More critically, the garrison's morale was deteriorating. Months of isolation, combined with the constant psychological pressure and growing internal divisions, had created an atmosphere of suspicion and despair. Soldiers questioned their officers' commitment. Officers doubted their men's loyalty. Everyone wondered if they had been forgotten by the empire they served. Cyrus found himself fighting two wars simultaneously, one against the Arabs outside his walls, and another against doubt and division within them. His attempts to maintain discipline grew increasingly harsh, which only widened the gulf between him and his Egyptian subjects. Public floggings for spreading rumors convinced many that he was more enemy than protector. The breaking point came when a group of Coptic priests, who had been providing spiritual comfort to Christian soldiers, requested permission to open negotiations with the Arabs about terms for surrender. Cyrus's furious refusal, accompanied by threats to execute any who spoke of surrender, convinced many that he cared more about his own pride than their lives. Stories from the siege. To understand the human cost of the siege, you must look beyond grand strategy to the individual stories of those who lived through these terrible months. On both sides of the walls, ordinary people struggled with extraordinary circumstances. Their choices and sacrifices shaping the course of history. Inside the fortress, a young Byzantine soldier named Michael wrote letters to his wife in Constantinople that were never sent, discovered centuries later in the ruins. "The Arabs do not attack," he wrote, "but their presence is like a fever that never breaks. Its men speak in whispers now, afraid that any word might be treason. I no longer know who to trust, or even what I am fighting for." In the same garrison, an Egyptian carpenter named Boutros faced an agonizing choice when Arab agents offered to smuggle his family too. Safety in exchange for information about the fortress's water supply. "They are Christians like us," his wife reportedly urged. "Why should we die for emperors who despise our faith?" On the Arab side, the siege tested different virtues. A Bedouin warrior named Khalid ibn Sufyan wrote to his tribal chief, "This is not the warfare of the desert, where brave men meet in honest battle. Here we wait and watch, while others slowly starve." Yet Amr says this is holy war, and that patience in God's cause is greater than valor. The strain affected even Amr himself. Contemporary accounts describe him growing gaunt and withdrawn as the siege dragged on, the weight of command etched in his face. He spent hours each day in prayer, seeking divine guidance for decisions that would determine the fate of thousands. One of the most poignant stories comes from a Christian monk named Father Abram, who served as an intermediary between the opposing forces. Moving freely between Arab camp and Byzantine fortress under flags of truce, he witnessed the human cost on both sides. "I saw soldiers who had become strangers to mercy," he later wrote, "and commanders who carried the weight of their choices like stones in their hearts." The dance of negotiation as winter approached and the siege's 7th month began. Both sides understood that a resolution was near. The fortress could not hold out indefinitely, but Amr also faced pressures. Reports of Persian preparations for a counteroffensive, concerns about his extended supply lines, and explicit orders from Caliph Umar to avoid unnecessary casualties. This mutual recognition of limitations opened the door for the complex negotiations that would determine Babylon's fate. Cyrus, despite his public statements about fighting to the death, secretly authorized preliminary discussions about terms. These talks, conducted through intermediaries and shrouded in secrecy, revealed the sophisticated diplomacy that characterized medieval warfare. Amr's negotiating strategy demonstrated his psychological acumen, rather than making threats or boasting. Of his strength, he focused on offering Cyrus a path to honorable surrender. He emphasized that resistance served no purpose now that the rest of Egypt was falling to Arab forces. He pointed out that unnecessary bloodshed would serve neither God nor the people both men claimed to protect. More subtly, he began to separate Cyrus personally from the Byzantine cause. In private messages, he suggested that a wise commander would recognize when circumstances had changed that there was no shame in acknowledging reality. He even hinted that Cyrus might find an honored place in the new order, his knowledge of Egypt valuable to its new rulers. These negotiations were complicated by the multi-layered nature of the siege, while Cyrus and Amr engaged in their diplomatic dance. Their subordinates conducted parallel discussions. Coptic Christians within the fortress began direct talks with Arab representatives about protection for their community. Local Egyptian troops explored terms for changing sides. Even some Byzantine officers quietly inquired about safe passage to Alexandria. The final act, the end, came not with a thunderous assault, but with a whisper of surrender. In December 640, after 7 months of siege, a small gate in Babylon's eastern wall quietly opened in the pre-dawn darkness. A handful of Arab soldiers slipped inside, followed by local guides who knew every corridor and chamber. The infiltration had been arranged by Egyptian sympathizers within the garrison. Men who had concluded that further resistance would only bring unnecessary bloodshed. They led the Arabs to key positions: the main gate, the armory, the commander's quarters, allowing Amar's forces to secure the fortress from within. When Cyrus awoke to find Arab soldiers in his chamber, the great siege was already over. The strongest fortress in Egypt had fallen not to catapults and battering rams, but to the patient erosion of will and the careful exploitation of division. The human cost of this bloodless victory was nonetheless profound. Families had been separated for months. Soldiers on both sides bore psychological scars from the long ordeal. The Coptic community, caught between competing loyalties, emerged deeply fractured. Even victory came with the bitter taste of human suffering. The conqueror's victory as Amr stood in the courtyard of the conquered fortress. Receiving the formal surrender of its defenders, he might have reflected on the nature of his achievement. He had not won through superior numbers or advanced weaponry, but through understanding of human nature, of political dynamics, of the complex forces that motivate people in extreme circumstances. The fall of Babylon opened the path to Alexandria and established Amr as the master of Egypt. But perhaps more importantly, it demonstrated a new kind of warfare, one that combined military pressure with psychological insight. That treated conquest not just as a matter of force, but as an exercise in persuasion and political engineering. The siege had lasted 7 months and cost relatively few lives, yet its consequences would echo through centuries. Egypt had passed from Byzantine to Islamic rule, setting in motion cultural and religious changes that continue to this day. And Amr ibn al-As had proven himself not just a conqueror, but an architect of a new world order as the morning sun rose over the captured fortress, illuminating the Crescent banners now flying from its towers. Both victors and vanquished faced an uncertain future. The old world of Byzantine Egypt was ending. The age of Islamic civilization in the Nile Valley was about to begin. And at the center of this transformation stood the man who had demonstrated that the greatest victories are often won not on the battlefield, but in the human heart. Alexandria was not just a city, it was a legend. For centuries, it had stood as the shining jewel of the Mediterranean, a place where the world's greatest minds gathered, where trade flourished, and where cultures from every corner of the known world met and mingled. Founded by Alexander the Great, the city had grown into a symbol of knowledge, wealth, and power. Its famous lighthouse, the Pharos, was counted among the wonders of the ancient world, guiding ships safely to its bustling harbors. The city's streets were alive with the sounds of merchants, scholars, priests, and travelers. Its grand buildings, temples, and palaces reflected the influence of Greek, Roman, Egyptian, and Christian civilizations. But by the early 7th century, Alexandria's fate was hanging in the balance. The city was still beautiful and important, but it was also vulnerable. The Byzantine Empire, which ruled Egypt at the time, was weakened by years of war, internal strife, and religious divisions. The people of Alexandria were a mix of Greeks, Copts, Jews, and others, and not all of them felt loyalty to the distant emperor in Constantinople. Some resented the heavy taxes and religious policies imposed by the Byzantines. Others simply wanted peace and stability. When Amr ibn Allahs and his Arab army arrived in Egypt, they knew that Alexandria was the ultimate prize. Whoever controlled Alexandria controlled the gateway between Africa, Asia, and Europe. The city's ports were vital for trade, and its wealth was legendary. Amr understood that taking Alexandria would not only secure Egypt for the new Muslim state, but also send a message to the world that a new power had risen. The road to Alexandria was not easy. The Moorish forces had already fought hard battles to reach the city, capturing key towns and fortresses along the way. The defenders of Alexandria, led by the Byzantine governor Cyrus, were determined to hold out. The city's walls were strong, and its defenders were well supplied. But the siege dragged on, and the pressure mounted on both sides. Inside Alexandria, life became tense and uncertain. The city's people watched anxiously as the Arab army surrounded them. Some hoped for a miracle, while others feared the worst. Food and supplies began to run low. Rumors spread quickly. Some said the Byzantines would send reinforcements. Others whispered that the city's leaders were considering surrender. Amr ibn Allahs was not just a warrior. He was also a shrewd negotiator. He knew that a long siege could be costly and destructive. He opened channels of communication with the city's leaders, offering terms of surrender that promised safety for the people and respect for their property and religious sites. The negotiations were tense. Cyrus, the governor, was under pressure from both the emperor and the city's population. He wanted to avoid unnecessary bloodshed, but he also did not want to be remembered as the man who gave up Alexandria without a fight. As the days turned into weeks, the situation inside the city grew more desperate. The defenders launched occasional sorties, trying to break the siege, but each time they were pushed back. The Arab army remained patient, tightening their grip and waiting for the right moment. Amr's strategy was to wear down the defenders, to make them realize that resistance was futile. Finally, after months of siege, the city's leaders agreed to negotiate seriously. The terms were discussed in detail. People of Alexandria would be allowed to keep their homes, their churches, and their possessions. The city would pay a tribute, but there would be no mass slaughter or destruction. The agreement was reached, and the gates of Alexandria were opened to Amr and his army. The entry of the Arab forces into Alexandria was a moment of both relief and sorrow. For many, it meant the end of fear and uncertainty. There was no widespread violence or looting. The city's people were allowed to go about their lives, though under new rulers. But for others, especially those loyal to the Byzantines, it was a moment of loss and humiliation. The city that had once been the pride of the empire was now in the hands of outsiders. The fate of Alexandria's famous Miscel library is a subject of much debate. Some stories claim that the great library was destroyed during the conquest, its priceless scrolls and books lost forever. Others argue that the library had already suffered damage in earlier conflicts and that little remained by the time Amr entered the city. What is certain is that the fall of Alexandria marked the end of an era. The city's role as the world's greatest center of learning was over. The surrender of Alexandria was not just a military event. It was a turning point in the lives of its people. The city's population was diverse, and each group reacted differently to the new reality. Some of the Greek and Roman elites who had enjoyed privileges under Byzantine rule felt a deep sense of loss. Their world had changed overnight. Many of them worried about their future, their property, and their status. Some chose to leave the city, seeking refuge in other parts of the Byzantine Empire. Others decided to stay, hoping to adapt to these new rulers and preserve what they could of their way of life. For the Copts, the native Egyptian Christians, the fall of Alexandria brought mixed feelings. For years, they had suffered under Byzantine religious policies, which often persecuted those who did not follow the official doctrine. The arrival of the Arabs, who promised religious tolerance and lower taxes, was seen by some as a relief. The new rulers allowed the Copts to practice their faith and manage their own affairs, as long as they paid the agreed tribute. This policy of relative tolerance helped to ease tensions and allowed the city to recover from the shock of conquest. The Jewish community in Alexandria also faced uncertainty. They had lived in the city for centuries, sometimes prospering, sometimes facing discrimination. Under the new administration, they were allowed to continue their religious practices and businesses, though they too had to pay the tribute. The city's markets and workshops slowly returned to life. As people adjusted to the new order, the fate of Alexandria's treasures and monuments was a subject of concern for many. The city was famous for its grand buildings, its statues, and its works of art. The conquerors, following the instructions of their leaders, generally avoided unnecessary destruction. The churches, synagogues, and public buildings were left standing. The famous lighthouse continued to guide ships into the harbor. However, some treasures were taken as spoils of war, and some private properties changed hands. The city's wealth was now under new management. The flow of taxes and goods shifted to the new rulers. The question of the library's fate continued to haunt the city. Some said that the conquerors ordered the burning of the remaining books, arguing that if the knowledge in them agreed with the Quran, it was unnecessary, and if it disagreed, it was dangerous. Others insisted that the library had already been destroyed in earlier times, and that only a few remnants remained. Whatever the truth, the loss of the library became a symbol of the end of Alexandria's golden age. Scholars and poets mourned the passing of a world where knowledge had been treasured above all else. As the days passed, the people of Alexandria began to adjust to their new reality. The city's administration was reorganized. Amir ibn Allahs appointed officials to collect taxes, maintain order, and oversee the daily life of the city. The tribute was collected efficiently, and the new rulers made efforts to keep the peace. The markets reopened, and trade resumed. Ships from distant lands continued to arrive in the harbor, bringing goods and news from across the Mediterranean. But beneath the surface, there was a sense of loss that could not be easily erased. The city's identity had been shaped by centuries of Greek, Roman, and Christian influence. Now a new culture was taking root. The Arabic language began to appear in official documents and public life. New customs and laws were introduced. The city's people had to learn to live with change, to find their place in a world that was no longer theirs alone. For Amir ibn Allahs, the conquest of Alexandria was a personal triumph. He had achieved what many thought impossible. He had taken one of the greatest cities in the world with minimal bloodshed and destruction. His reputation as a leader and a statesman was secure. But he also understood the weight of responsibility that came with victory. He knew that ruling Alexandria would not be easy. The city was proud, complex, and full of competing interests. Keeping the peace would require wisdom, patience, and a willingness to listen to the people. The fall of Alexandria also had a profound impact on the wider world. News of the city's surrender spread quickly, reaching the courts of Europe and Asia. The Byzantine Empire was shocked by the loss of its greatest city in the East. The Christian world mourned the fall of a center of faith and learning. In the Muslim world, the conquest was celebrated as a sign of divine favor and the beginning of a new era. The emotional aftermath of Alexandria's fall was complex and deeply felt by all who lived through it. For the conquerors, there was a sense of triumph. The city that had once seemed invincible was now under their control. The soldiers who had marched across deserts and fought in countless battles could finally rest, their mission accomplished. Amr ibn Alas and his commanders were praised for their strategy and restraint. The victory was seen as a sign that their cause was just and that their faith was strong. But even among the victors, there was an awareness of the weight of conquest. Alexandria was not just any city. It was a place of history, culture, and learning. Some of the Arab leaders walked through its streets in awe, realizing that they were now responsible for a city that had been the heart of the ancient world. The responsibility to govern wisely and justly was heavy. Amr ibn Alas, in particular, was careful to maintain order and respect the city's traditions. He knew that the eyes of the world were watching, and that the future of Muslim rule in Egypt depended on how Alexandria was treated. For the people of Alexandria, the emotions were more complicated. There was relief that the siege was over and that the city had not been destroyed. Many were grateful that their lives and homes had been spared. The markets reopened, and daily life resumed, though under new rulers. But there was also a deep sense of loss. The city's connection to the Byzantine Empire was broken. The familiar rhythms of life were disrupted. Some families were separated, as those who could not accept the new order chose to leave. The city's scholars and priests felt the loss most keenly. For generations, Alexandria had been a beacon of knowledge and faith. Now they faced an uncertain future. Some tried to preserve what they could of the city's traditions, copying manuscripts and teaching in secret. Others adapted to the new rulers, hoping to find a place in the changing world. The fate of the library, whether it was destroyed in the conquest or had already faded away, became a symbol of the end of an era. The loss of so much knowledge was mourned not just in Alexandria, but across the world. The conquerors, too, were changed by their experience in Alexandria. Many of the Arab soldiers had never seen a city so grand, with its wide streets, tall buildings, and bustling markets. They were impressed by the city's organization and the diversity of its people. Some began to adopt local customs, learning new skills and making connections with the city's residents. The blending of cultures began slowly, but it would shape the future of Egypt for centuries to come. The fall of Alexandria also had practical consequences. The city's wealth was now in the hands of the new rulers. Taxes and tribute flowed too, the Muslim state strengthening its position in the region. The ports of Alexandria became gateways for trade and communication between the Islamic world and the Mediterranean. The city's strategic value was clear to all. Whoever controlled Alexandria controlled the flow of goods, people, and ideas between continents. But the weight of conquest was not just about power and wealth. It was also about responsibility. Amr ibn Alas understood that ruling Alexandria meant more than collecting taxes and enforcing laws. It meant winning the trust of the people respecting their traditions and ensuring justice. He worked to maintain peace between the city's different communities, appointing local leaders and judges to help govern. He encouraged trade and learning, hoping to restore some of the city's former glory. Over time, the people of Alexandria began to adapt. Some embraced the new rulers, finding opportunities in the changing world. Others held on to their old ways, remembering the past with pride and sorrow. The city itself changed as new buildings rose and old ones were repurposed. The Arabic language became more common, and Islamic customs began to influence daily life. But the memory of what Alexandria had been lingered on, a reminder of a lost golden age. The story of Alexandria's fall is not just a tale of conquest and loss. It is also a story of resilience and adaptation. The city survived, its people endured, and new chapters were written in its long history. The lessons of Alexandria about the power of knowledge, the dangers of division, and the challenges of change go far beyond its walls. In the end, the fall of Alexandria was both an ending and a beginning. The city's ancient glory was gone, but its spirit lived on. The conquerors and the conquered alike were changed by the experience. The world watched as Alexandria entered a new era. Its fate now tied to the rise of a new civilization. After the conquest of Alexandria, Amr ibn Alas faced a new and even greater challenge, ruling Egypt. Conquest was one thing, but governance was another. Egypt was a vast and ancient land, with a complex society and a long history of powerful rulers. Now Amr was responsible for bringing order, stability, prosperity to a country that just experienced the shock of invasion and the fall of its greatest city. Amr's first task as governor was to establish control and restore order. The transition from Byzantine to Arab rule was not easy. There were still pockets of resistance, and many people were uncertain about what the future would bring. Amr moved quickly to reassure the population. He issued proclamations promising safety for all who accepted the new rule, regardless of their religion or background. He made it clear that the people's property, homes, and places of worship would be protected. This policy of tolerance helped to calm fears and win the support of many Egyptians, especially the Copts, who had suffered under Byzantine religious policies. One of Amr's most important reforms was the introduction of a new system of taxation. Under the Byzantines, taxes had been high and often unfairly collected. Many Egyptians, especially the peasants, had struggled under the burden. Amr ordered a survey of the land and population to create a more just and efficient tax system. New taxes were generally lower than before, and they were collected in a more organized way. The Kopis, who had experience in administration, were employed to help manage the system. This not only improved the collection of revenue, but also gave the local population a stake in the new government. Amr also worked to rebuild Egypt's economy. The years of war and instability had disrupted trade and agriculture. Amr encouraged farmers to return to their fields and merchants to reopen their shops. He repaired canals and irrigation systems, which were vital for Egypt's agriculture. He also promoted trade with other parts of the Muslim world, making Egypt a key link between Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean. The revival of the economy helped to restore confidence and stability, but Amr's reforms were not just about administration and economics. He also faced the challenge of balancing the interests of different groups in Egyptian society: the Arab, Conquerors were a small minority, but they held power. The Copts were the majority, and they had their own traditions and leaders. The remnants of the Byzantine elite still had influence in some areas. Amr had to find a way to govern all these groups fairly and keep the peace. He appointed local leaders from each community to help administer the country. He respected the authority of the Coptic Church and allowed it to manage its own affairs. He also maintained good relations with the Jewish community and other minorities. By giving each group a role in the new administration, Amr was able to build a sense of shared responsibility and reduce the risk of rebellion. One of Amr's most lasting achievements was the founding of a new city, Fustat. After the conquest, Amr decided not to make Alexandria the capital of Muslim Egypt. Instead, he chose a site near the old Roman fortress of Babylon, close to the Nile and at the crossroads of important trade routes. Here, he ordered the construction of a new city that would serve as the administrative and military center of Egypt. Fustat grew rapidly, attracting people from all over Egypt and beyond. The city was laid out with wide streets, markets, mosques, and public buildings. Amr built the first mosque in Egypt, known as the Mosque of Amr ibn Alas, which became a center of religious and social life. Fustat soon became the heart of Muslim Egypt, a symbol of the new era that had begun. The creation of Fustat also had practical benefits. It allowed the new rulers to keep a close watch on the country and respond quickly to any threats. It provided a base for the Arab army and a hub for trade and communication. Over time, Fustat would grow into one of the great cities of the Islamic world, laying the foundation for the later city of Cairo. Amr ibn Alas's rule was not without its challenges. Governing a land as diverse and complex as Egypt required constant attention and adaptability. The Arab conquerors, though victorious, were still newcomers in a society with deep roots and established traditions. Amr had to ensure that his own followers remained loyal and disciplined, while also preventing resentment and unrest among the local population. One of the main Amr faced was maintaining justice and fairness. In a society where old grievances ran deep, the Copts, who had suffered under Byzantine rule, now looked to the new administration for relief. Amr made efforts to ensure that justice was accessible to all, regardless of religion or background. He appointed judges who were known for their integrity and encouraged people to bring their complaints to the authorities. Disputes between Muslims and non-Muslims were handled with care, and Amr often intervened personally in difficult cases to ensure a fair outcome. Amr also had to deal with the expectations of the Arab settlers. Many of them had come to Egypt seeking wealth and opportunity. Some expected to be rewarded with land and privileges. Amr tried to balance their interests with the need to maintain good relations with the local population. He discouraged the seizure of property from Egyptians and insisted that the rights of all residents be respected. This policy was not always popular with his own followers, but Amr believed that long-term stability depended on justice and moderation. Religious policy was another area where Amr showed pragmatism and flexibility. He allowed the Copts and other Christian groups to practice their faith freely as long as they paid the required tribute. He also respected the authority of the Coptic Patriarch and worked with him to resolve disputes. This approach helped to win the loyalty of many Egyptians and reduce the risk of rebellion. At the same time, Amr encouraged the spread of Islam, building mosques and supporting religious education. Over time, more Egyptians began to convert to Islam, attracted by the new opportunities and the sense of belonging to a rising power. The transformation of Egypt under Amer's rule was not just political or economic, it was also cultural. The arrival of the Arabs brought new customs, language, and ideas. Arabic gradually replaced Greek and Coptic as the language of administration and public life. The city of Fustat became a melting pot where people from different backgrounds lived and worked together. The influence of Islamic law and culture began to shape daily life. From the way people dressed to the way they conducted business, Amer's leadership style was marked by simplicity and accessibility, lived modestly, avoided displays of wealth, and was known for his direct approach. He often met with ordinary people, listened to their concerns, and tried to solve their problems. This approach earned him respect and helped to build trust between the rulers and the ruled. Amer's reputation for honesty and fairness became a model for later governors. Despite his successes, Amer's rule was not without controversy. Some of his decisions were criticized by both Arabs and Egyptians. There were disputes over taxes, land, and religious policy. At times, tensions flared between different communities, and Amer had to act quickly to restore order. He faced pressure from the Caliph in Medina to increase revenues and enforce Islamic law more strictly. Balancing these demands with the realities on the ground was a constant challenge. Amer's relationship with the caliphs was complex. He was respected for his achievements, but his independent style sometimes brought him into conflict with the central authorities. At one point, he was removed from his position as governor, only to be reinstated later when his skills were needed. Amer's ability to navigate the shifting politics of the early Islamic State was a testament to his intelligence and adaptability. The building of Fustat and the transformation of Egypt under Amr Ibn Allah's left a mark that would last for centuries. Fustat quickly became a center of administration, commerce, and culture. Its markets were filled with goods from across the Mediterranean and beyond. Craftsmen, traders, and scholars flocked to the new city, bringing with them skills and ideas that enriched Egyptian society. The city's mosque became not only a place of worship, but also a gathering place for discussion, learning, and community affairs. Amer's vision for Fustat was practical as well as symbolic. By founding a new capital, he distanced the administration from the old Byzantine centers of power and created a city that reflected the new order. Fustat's location near the Nile and at the crossroads of trade routes made it ideal for controlling the flow of goods and people. The city's rapid growth was a sign of Egypt's recovery and adaptation to the new era. The transformation of Egypt was not without its difficulties. The process of integrating Arab, Coptic, and Byzantine traditions was complex and sometimes tense. There were disputes over land, religious practices, and the distribution of power. Amr worked to mediate these conflicts, often relying on negotiation and compromise. He understood that Egypt's strength lay in its diversity, and that lasting peace required respect for all communities. Amer's struggle for justice was ongoing. He faced the challenge of ensuring that the new rulers did not become oppressors themselves. He reminded his officials and soldiers that their duty was to serve the people, not to exploit them. Stories spread of Amer's personal involvement in cases of injustice, where he would intervene to protect the weak or punish the corrupt. His commitment to fairness became part of his legacy, remembered by Egyptians long after his rule ended. Power, however, always brought its own temptations and dangers. As governor, Amr had to balance the interests of the caliph in Medina, the Arab settlers, and the Egyptian population. He was constantly aware that his position depended on his ability to maintain order and deliver results. At times, he faced opposition from rival leaders, both within Egypt and in the broader Muslim world. Political intrigue and competition for influence were ever-present realities. Amr's legacy was shaped not only by his achievements, but also by the challenges he faced. He was a conqueror who became a builder, a warrior who became a statesman. His policies laid the foundations for centuries of Muslim rule in Egypt. The systems of administration, taxation, and justice that he established endured long after his death. The city of Fustat grew into a great metropolis, eventually giving rise to Cairo, one of the world's most important cities. Yet Amr's story is also a reminder of the complexities of power. His efforts to balance justice, stability, and the interests of different groups were not always successful. There were times when his policies were resisted or misunderstood. The process of change was often painful, and not everyone benefited equally. But Amr's willingness to listen, adapt, and seek compromise helped to guide Egypt through a period of profound transformation. In the end, Amr ibn al-Az's rule was defined by his ability to bring people together and to build something new out of the ruins of the old. His vision for Egypt was one of unity, prosperity, and justice. The challenges he faced were great, but his determination and skill allowed him to overcome them. The legacy of his reforms and leadership continued to shape Egypt for generations, making him one of the most important figures in the country's long and storied history. Amr ibn al-Az's legacy was never simple. For all his achievements as a conqueror and governor, his name was often surrounded by controversy. Accusations of greed, ambition, and betrayal followed him throughout his career, casting a shadow over his reputation. Some saw him as a brilliant leader who brought stability and prosperity to Egypt. Others whispered that he was driven by personal gain, always seeking more power and wealth for himself. The roots of these accusations lay in the very qualities that made Amr successful. He was ambitious, resourceful, and unafraid to take risks. He knew how to seize opportunities and was skilled at navigating the complex politics of the early Islamic world. But these same traits made him a target for suspicion. Rivals accused him of putting his own interests above those of the community. Stories spread that he had enriched himself with the spoils of Egypt, that he had favored his own followers, and that he had used his position to build a personal empire. Amr's relationship with other Muslim leaders was often tense. His dealings with Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, in particular, were marked by both respect and conflict. Umar valued Amr's abilities and relied on him to govern Egypt, but he also distrusted Amr's independence and ambition. Umar was known for his strictness and his insistence on justice and equality. He kept a close watch on his governors, demanding regular reports and holding them accountable for their actions. There were times when Umar and Amr clashed openly. Umar once removed Amr from his position as governor, replacing him with another leader. The reasons for this decision were complex, involving disputes over tax revenues, complaints from local communities, and concerns about Amr's growing influence. Amr did not accept his dismissal quietly. He argued his case, defended his record, and eventually regained his position. But the episode left a mark. fueling rumors that Amr was too powerful and too independent for the good of the state. Amr's conflicts did not end with Umar. When Uthman ibn Affan became caliph, the political landscape shifted again. Uthman faced growing unrest and accusations of favoritism within the Muslim community. Amr, who had his own network of supporters, sometimes found himself at odds with the new administration. He was removed from office once more, only to be called back when his skills were needed. These cycles of appointment and dismissal reflected the turbulent politics of the time, as well as the difficulty of balancing personal ambition with the demands of leadership. The controversies surrounding Amr were not just about politics and power. They also raised deeper philosophical questions about the nature of leadership. Can a conqueror also be a just ruler? Is it possible to pursue personal ambition and still serve the greater good? Amr's life was a test case for these questions. He had risen to power through war and conquest, but he had also worked to bring stability and justice to Egypt. His policies often benefited the people, but his motives were always questioned. Some argued that Amr's ambition was unnecessary. Part of his success, without his drive and determination, Egypt might never have been brought under Muslim rule. His willingness to take risks and make difficult decisions allowed him to achieve what others could not. But others saw his ambition as a flaw, a sign that he cared more for his own advancement than for the welfare of the community. The debate over Amr's character became a reflection of broader tensions within the early Islamic world, as leaders struggled to define the meaning of justice, power, and responsibility. The emotional cost of power was another aspect of Amr's story. Leadership brought not only rewards but also burdens. Amr was often isolated, caught between competing interests, and forced to make difficult choices. He faced criticism from all sides: his rivals, his followers, and the people he governed. The loneliness of leadership weighed heavily on him, especially in times of crisis. He had to balance the demands of the caliph, the expectations of his own supporters, and the needs of the Egyptian people. Amr ibn al-As's personal life reflected the burdens of his public role. He was a man who had seen the heights of power and the depths of suspicion. He had been celebrated as a hero and condemned as a schemer. The constant scrutiny and shifting alliances took their toll. Even among his closest allies, trust was never absolute. In the world of early Islamic politics, loyalty was fragile. Yesterday's friend could become tomorrow's rival. The emotional cost of leadership was not just about loneliness. It was also about the sacrifices required to maintain authority. Amr often had to make decisions that pleased no one. When he enforced strict tax policies, he angered the local population. When he showed leniency, he faced criticism from the caliph and other Arab leaders. Every choice carried risks, and every success brought new challenges. The pressure to maintain order, deliver results, protect his own position was relentless. Amr's conflicts with other Muslim leaders were not limited to Umar and Uthman. He also had to navigate relationships with other powerful figures, such as Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, the governor of Syria. The early Muslim empire was expanding rapidly, and competition for influence was fierce. Amr's skills as a negotiator and strategist were constantly tested. He sometimes found himself caught between rival factions, forced to choose sides in disputes that could shape the future of the entire community. The question of whether a conqueror could also be a just ruler remained at the heart of Amr's legacy. His supporters pointed to his reforms in Egypt, his efforts to protect the rights of non-Muslims, and his commitment to justice. They argued that his ambition was balanced by a genuine concern for the welfare of the people. His critics, however, saw only the pursuit of power and the willingness to compromise principles for personal gain. The truth, as always, was more complicated. Amr was both a product of his time and a shaper of history, a man whose strengths and weaknesses were inseparable. As Amr grew older, the weight of his experiences became more apparent. He had lived through wars, revolutions, and the rise and fall of empires. He had seen friends and rivals rise and fall, and he had survived by adapting to changing circumstances. The lessons he learned were hard ones, that power is always temporary, that loyalty is never guaranteed, and that every decision leaves its mark. In his later years, Amor reflected on the meaning of his life and the legacy he would leave behind. He knew that history would judge him not only for his victories but also for his controversies. He understood that the story of his rule in Egypt was part of a larger story, the story of a new civilization struggling to define itself, to balance justice and ambition, and to find its place in the world. The loneliness of leadership was perhaps the greatest cost of all. Amr had achieved more than most men could dream of, but he had paid a high price. The burdens of responsibility, the constant suspicion, and the knowledge that every action would be judged by future generations weighed heavily on him. Yet, despite all the controversy, Amr ibn Alas remained a central figure in the history of Egypt and the early Muslim world. His life was a testament to the complexities of power, the challenges of leadership, the enduring struggle to balance ambition with justice. In the end, Amr's story is a reminder that history is rarely simple. The same qualities that make a person great can also make them controversial. The same actions that bring triumph can also bring criticism. Amr ibn Alas was a conqueror, a ruler, a reformer, and a survivor. His legacy is a mirror of the world he helped to shape, full of contradictions, challenges, and the never-ending search for justice and meaning in the final years of his life. Amr ibn Alas found himself at the center of political intrigue and personal reflection. The world he had helped to shape was changing rapidly, and the challenges of leadership had grown more complex. The early unity of the Muslim community was beginning to fracture, and old rivalries were resurfacing. Amr, who had always been a master of navigating shifting alliances, now faced some of the most difficult choices of his career. After years of service as Egypt's governor, Amr's relationship with the central authorities in Medina and later Damascus became increasingly complicated. The caliphs valued his experience and his ability to maintain order in Egypt, but they also worried about his independence and influence. Amr was both respected and mistrusted, a man whose loyalty was always questioned by those in power. He was removed from office more than once, only to be recalled when his skills were needed to resolve crises. During the first fitna, the first major civil war in the Islamic world, Amr's political instincts were put to the test. The conflict between Ali ibn Abi Talib and Muawi ibn Abi Sufyan divided the Muslim community. Amr, ever the strategist, aligned himself with Muawiyah, the governor of Syria. He played a key role in the arbitration process after the Battle of Siffin, using his skills as a negotiator to influence the outcome. This decision was controversial and earned him both praise and criticism. Some saw him as a defender of stability, while others accused him of opportunism and betrayal. Amr's later years were also marked by personal losses. The burdens of leadership, the constant political maneuvering, and the loss of old friends and allies weighed heavily on him. He had outlived many of his contemporaries, and the world around him was no longer the same as the one he had known in his youth. The loneliness of power became more acute, and Amr spent more time reflecting on the meaning of his life and the legacy he would leave behind. Despite the controversies and challenges, Amr remained a central figure in Egypt until his death. He continued to oversee the administration of the province, working to maintain order and stability. He was known for his wisdom and pragmatism, and even his critics acknowledged his ability to get things done. As he grew older, Amr became more reflective, often speaking about the fleeting nature of power and the importance of justice. When Amr ibn al-As died, Egypt and the wider Muslim world paused to consider the passing of a remarkable figure. His death marked the end of an era. In Egypt, there was a sense of uncertainty about the future. Amr had been the face of Arab rule for decades, and his absence left a void. The people of Egypt, both Arab and Copt, remembered him in different ways. Some mourned the loss of a strong and capable leader who had brought stability and prosperity. Others saw his death as the end of a difficult chapter, hoping for new opportunities under different rulers. In the wider Muslim world, reactions to Amr's death were mixed. Among his supporters, there was admiration for his achievements and his role in expanding the Islamic State. Among his critics, there was relief that a controversial and sometimes divisive figure was gone. The caliphs and other leaders recognized the importance of his contributions, but they also moved quickly to assert their own authority in Egypt. The immediate aftermath of Amr's death saw a period of transition in Egypt. New governors were appointed, and the administration continued to evolve. The systems and institutions that Amr had established endured, providing a foundation for future rulers. The city of Fustat remained the center of government and commerce, a testament to Amr's vision and leadership. As the years passed, the memory of Amr ibn al-As became a subject of debate and interpretation. How should history remember him? Was he a hero who brought order and prosperity to Egypt, or a cunning politician who pursued his own interests above all else? The answer depended on who was telling the story. For many Egyptians, especially those who benefited from his reforms and policies, Amr was remembered as a strong and effective ruler. He had ended the chaos of war, lowered taxes, and allowed religious communities to manage their own affairs. The city of Fustat, which he founded, became a symbol of renewal and progress. His mosque stood as a reminder of the new era he had ushered in. For these people, Amr was a hero, a man who had shaped the destiny of their country. Others, however, saw a more complicated figure. Amr's ambition and willingness to shift allegiances made some question his motives. His role in the political intrigues of the early Muslim world, especially during the first fitna, led some to view him as a symbol of the dangers of unchecked ambition. Critics pointed to his conflicts with other leaders, his accumulation of wealth, and his sometimes ruthless tactics. For them, Amr was a reminder that power often comes at a cost, and that even the greatest achievements can be tainted by controversy. Historians and scholars have continued to debate Amr's legacy for centuries. Some emphasize his role as a builder and reformer, highlighting the stability and prosperity he brought to Egypt. Others focus on the darker aspects of his career, including the accusations of greed and betrayal. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Amr was a product of his time, a time of great change, uncertainty, and opportunity. he was both a conqueror and a statesman, a man who could be both generous and calculating. The enduring impact of Amr's conquest of Egypt cannot be overstated. His leadership marked the beginning of a new chapter in Egyptian history, as the Arab and Islamic influence he helped establish would shape the country for centuries to come. The systems of administration, taxation, and justice that he put in place became the foundation for later rulers. The blending of Arab, Coptic, Byzantine traditions created a unique Egyptian identity that endures to this day. Amr's conquest also had wider implications for the world. By bringing Egypt into the Islamic State, he opened new routes for trade, culture, and ideas. Egypt became a bridge between Africa, Asia, and Europe, playing a central role in the development of the medieval world. The city of Fustat, and later Cairo, became centers of learning, commerce, and culture. The legacy of Amr's rule extended far beyond his own lifetime, influencing the course of history in ways he could never have imagined in the end. Amr ibn Alas remains a figure who defies easy categorization. He was a man of action and ambition, but also of vision and pragmatism. His life was marked by triumph and controversy, by moments of greatness and episodes of doubt. The story of his final years and legacy is a reminder that history is shaped by individuals who are both products and shapers of their times. The memory of Amr ibn Alas lives on in Egypt and the wider world. His mosque still stands in Cairo, a testament to his role in the country's history. His name is remembered in stories, debates, and the very fabric of Egyptian society. Whether seen as a hero, a villain, or something in between, Amr's impact endures a legacy of conquest, reform, and the enduring struggle to balance power, justice, and ambition. The story of Amr ibn Alas did not end with his death. His actions, decisions, and legacy continued to echo through the centuries, shaping the destiny of Egypt, the Islamic world, and the wider Mediterranean. The conquest of Egypt was not just a military victory. It was a turning point that set in motion changes that would affect millions of lives and alter the course of history. Philosophers and historians have long debated the meaning of Amr's legacy. Was he a man of vision who brought order and justice to a troubled land? Or was he simply another conqueror, driven by ambition and the pursuit of power? The answer is not simple, because Amr's life and actions were full of contradictions. He was both a product of his time and a force that helped to shape it. One of the most significant aspects of Amr's legacy is the way his conquest transformed Egypt. Before the arrival of the Arabs, Egypt had been ruled by a succession of foreign powers: Persians, Greeks, Romans, and Byzantines. Each had left its mark, but none had fully integrated Egypt into a new cultural and religious world. Amr's conquest brought Egypt into the orbit of Islam, connecting it to a rapidly expanding civilization that stretched from Spain to India. This transformation was not just political. The introduction of Arabic as the language of administration, the spread of Islam, and the blending of Arab and Egyptian traditions created a new identity for the country. Over time, Egypt became one of the most important centers of the Islamic world, known for its scholars, artists, and merchants. The city of Fustat and later Cairo became symbols of this new era place where people from different backgrounds could meet, trade, and learn from one another. Amar's actions also had a profound impact on the wider Mediterranean. The conquest of Egypt shifted the balance of power in the region. The Byzantine Empire, once the dominant force in the eastern Mediterranean, was weakened by the loss of its richest province. The new Muslim rulers of Egypt controlled the vital grain supply that fed much of the Mediterranean world. Shifted and new connections were forged between Africa, Asia, and Europe. The spread of Islam in Egypt and beyond was not just a matter of conquest, it was also a process of adaptation and negotiation. Amar's policies of religious tolerance and pragmatic governance helped to win the support of many Egyptians, especially those who had suffered under previous rulers. The Copts, Jews, and other minorities were allowed to practice their faiths and manage their own affairs, as long as they paid the required tribute. This approach helped to create a relatively stable and prosperous society. Even as the country underwent profound changes, yet the legacy of Amar's conquest is not without controversy. Modern historians and thinkers continue to debate whether he should be remembered as a liberator or an invader. Some argue that his actions freed Egypt from the oppression of the Byzantines and opened the door to a new era of cultural and economic flourishing. Others see the conquest as the beginning of a long period of foreign domination, in which the interests of the conquerors often took precedence over those of the local population. The debate over Amar's legacy reflects broader questions about the nature of history and the people who shape it. Is it possible for a conqueror to also be a reformer? Can the pursuit of power ever be truly separated from the desire to do good? Amar's life offers no easy answers. He was a man who achieved great things, but also made difficult choices that had lasting consequences. His story is a reminder that history is rarely black and white, and that the actions of individuals can have both positive and negative effects. The echoes of Amar's actions can still be felt in Egypt and the wider world today. The systems of administration, law, and culture that he helped to establish have endured for centuries. The blending of Arab and Egyptian traditions created a unique identity that continues to define the country. The city of Cairo, which grew out of Fustat, remains one of the great cities of the world, a testament to the enduring impact of Amar's vision. The question of whether Amr ibn Alas was a liberator or an invader is still discussed in Egypt and beyond. For some, he is remembered as the man who ended centuries of foreign rule and brought a new sense of unity and purpose to the country. His policies of tolerance and reform are seen as evidence of his desire to build, not just to conquer. The fact that Egypt became a center of learning, trade, and culture under Muslim rule is often cited as proof of the positive impact of his leadership. For others, however, the memory is more complicated. The conquest of Egypt was, after all, an act of war. It brought new rulers, new laws, and new customs. Some Egyptians lost their positions and privileges, while others had to adapt to a new way of life. The process of change was not always smooth or peaceful. There were moments of resistance, hardship, and loss. The debate over Amar's legacy is in many ways a reflection of the broader challenges of understanding history itself. Modern historians try to look beyond simple labels. They examine the evidence, weigh the different perspectives, and try to understand the context in which Amar lived and acted. They recognize that he was both a product of his time and a man who helped to shape it. His actions were influenced by the needs and values of his society, but they also had consequences that went far beyond his own intentions. the philosophical questions raised by Amir's life remain relevant today. What does it mean to be a just ruler? Can power be used for good, or does it always corrupt? How should we judge the actions of those who lived in different times and faced different challenges? Amir's story invites us to think deeply about these questions, to recognize the complexity of history, and to avoid easy answers. The impact of Amir's conquest on Egypt and the world is still visible. The Arabic language, the Islamic faith, and the systems of governance he helped to establish are all part of Egypt's identity. The city of Cairo, with its mosques, markets, and universities, stands as a living legacy of the changes he set in motion. The blending of cultures and traditions that began in Amir's time continues to shape the country's character and its place in the world. Amir's legacy also serves as a reminder of the power of individuals to shape history. He was not a king or an emperor, but his actions changed the course of nations. His ability to adapt, to negotiate, and to lead made him one of the most influential figures of his age. The choices he made, both good and bad, had consequences that lasted long. After his death, in the end, the story of Amr ibn al-As is a story about the complexity of history and the men who shape it. It is a story of ambition and vision, of conflict and compromise, of triumph and loss. It is a reminder that the past is never simple, and that the legacy of those who came before us is always open to interpretation. As we look back on Amir's life and times, we are reminded that history is not just a record of events, but a conversation between the past and the present. The questions raised by his actions about justice, power, and the meaning of leadership are still with us today. The echoes of his life continue to shape the world, inviting us to reflect on our own choices and the kind of legacy we wish to leave behind.